So hello, everybody. Welcome to Skype a Scientist Live. Let's think about announcements. What's happening next week on the live streams? We've got Ask a Fossil Preparator. That's with Miria Perez. That's going to be on the 11th at 11 a.m. Eastern. And then we're going to be talking about how to save endangered snails with Alyssa Frederick. That's going to be on May 13th at 2 p.m. This week and next week, we have only 2 sessions a week, but then after that, we'll ramp back up to 3 or more. We've got a lot of cool stuff happening in June, so get excited about that. And for the rest of this month. So, Skype a Scientist is a nonprofit organization, and we try to bring science to people as much as humanly possible. And so if you can support our program, you can do that at patreon.com/SkypeAScientist or paypal.me/SkypeAScientist. And that's really all the housekeeping we've got today. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to our guest today, Caitlynn, to introduce herself.
Hi, my name's Caitlynn. I obviously have a very small apartment, so there's stuff going on in the background. My name's Caitlynn Beckett. I'm a PhD candidate at Memorial University, which is in St. John's, Newfoundland, Canada. But I actually live in the Yukon. I'm doing my research there, so I'm living there now, which is also in Canada, I guess, for anyone who's tuning in from far away. And I'm a geographer, and I focus on human geography, so kind of more of a social scientist rather than doing kind of the classic mapping of what you would think of as a geographer. And my research looks at contaminated landscapes, mostly in northern Canada. And so that includes lots of mine sites, also do a little bit of reading about oil sites as well in northern Canada. And so my research focuses on helping communities figure out what they want to do with those contaminated landscapes or toxic landscapes. So a lot of them are really dangerous and have to be taken care of for a really long time after mining or oil is complete. So yeah, we work together to figure out kind of the best way to do that safely, and also to ensure that communities who maybe have been harmed by those projects get some kind of justice for that too. Yeah.
That sounds really cool. So what exactly is it? So is it specifically about like something about things that we use for fuel, like coal, like petroleum, that are particularly nasty for and toxic to humans?
Yep. So oil fields obviously have a lot of contamination issues, coal as well. A lot of the sites that I work on are hard rock mining, so like things like gold, even silver, so things that we like, you know, generally think of as jewelry, can have a lot of kind of harms for the environment and for people. And so some of those things might include what we call like tailings ponds, which is kind of like all of the leftover waste from processing, so oil or mines or other types of extractive industries, so anything that's a non-renewable resource. And so that's usually, depending on the kind of material you're pulling out of the ground, it's a mix of different kinds of contaminants that are left behind, and yeah, they're called tailings. And so usually what the kind of main concern is that kind of contamination getting into water systems. So that's really bad for people, and it's also really bad for surrounding environments. And in northern Canada specifically as well, a problem called acid rock drainage, which means when you break apart all the rocks to get all of the bits out of it, it can make the rocks generate more acid, which changes the pH or the amount of acid in the environment, which is also really bad for water systems.
Interesting. So is it more about the stuff that we're getting to, or maybe the chemicals or the other processes that we use to either clean them up or get to them that are the nasty bits, or both?
Both.
Both. Okay, back to all angles.
Yeah, I guess it's So when you're actually kind of taking apart, so there's different kind of processes when you're digging, especially for a mine, say like a gold mine or like iron or lead or anything like that. When you're digging everything up and you're breaking apart the rocks to get those pieces, you're left with what's called waste rock, which is kind of like the big chunks left over after you actually break up rock. And so that's where the kind of acid generating part comes from. It's essentially exposing rock to more oxygen in the air faster than it would normally be exposed just in natural processes. And that changes the kind of chemical and acidic composition of the environment. And then the kind of second part of that, the tailings part, is when you're actually processing the littler pieces of rock that you already kind of extracted. And there's a lot of different processing techniques. Some of that includes using other chemicals like cyanide. So that's used a lot in gold extraction. And that is basically using those chemicals to pull out the pieces of gold. And those chemicals stay in the tailings, which is kind of like a really gross looking paste, watery substance that's really broken down rock, and pulling the chemicals, using chemicals to pull the minerals out of those little pieces of rock and smashing everything up. So along the whole stage, there's different environmental problems. And then when you get to the closure of like an oil well or a mine, all of that stuff is still left behind. And it's not easy to transport it because there's so much of it, right? So some of the sites that I work on, there's football fields and football fields full of this stuff. So they're pretty expansive.
Wow. And so if you were to leave one of these sites alone and not intervene at all, how long would it take for those areas to go from like nasty to okay?
Like for them to get better over time, you're saying?
Yeah, like if humans, we made a mess effectively and then we don't do anything at all, like how long would it take naturally for those nasty areas to be like safe for animals?
So it would really depend on the type of mine. So if you have something like uranium, it like for like nuclear energy, say, right, those kinds of materials are radioactive, but they have what's called a half-life. So over time, any kind of radioactive contaminated material will break down, and over hundreds of thousands of years, it will become safe again.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So it takes a really long time.
Really long time.
Yeah.
Okay, so then
materials like the acid rock drainage kind of issue, which is usually what you see from like gold mines or lead and zinc mines and things that are in what's called sulfidic rock, which is, there's a lot of it in northern Canada. That doesn't really go away. So the potential for it to generate acid or for it to change the pH of the environment just will continually go up. Wow. That's a problem that will kind of get better.
Oh boy. Okay, so and you focus on how to make it better. So how do we clean it up?
So it's kind of a tricky situation where in a lot of cases it's impossible to make it totally clean. So it's we're not able to make the contamination go away. Or to fix a toxic environment. Not like, if you think of like cleaning something, usually, it's going away or it's becoming safe again. And so these sites will never really be what they used to be. And they won't necessarily be safe in some cases. Especially a lot of the sites I work on are like the really kind of big, super toxic sites. So usually when we talk about making them safe or what's called remediating or reclaiming or restoring some of these extractive landscapes, it means that what we're trying to do is contain the contamination or make it as safe as possible. So what a lot of kind of mining engineers and geologists and biologists are all working on is how to make sure that limit the contamination to the surrounding environment as much as possible. And so one site that I work on is called the Faro Mine in the Yukon, and it's an old lead zinc mine. And they have, I think, 300,000 tons of waste rock, which is like really hard to picture in your mind. But if you think about when you're on site, you just can't see the end of the waste rock, and there's piles of them. And so what we'll do is put covers over it. Sorry, not me, but engineers will do, is put covers over it. And so this means like different kinds of layers of rock, what's called a geotextile liner, which is kind of like a plastic liner. And they'll layer that so that water disperses over the piles instead of going through the piles of waste rock. Yeah, exactly. And then they'll collect the water that runs off of those piles of rock and treat it so that it's safe to go back into the environment. Yeah, and a lot of times as well, we'll revegetate on top of those covers. That helps to reduce erosion, and also helps in kind of the community aspect of it, of people feeling better about the site and feeling like they're able to heal it in a way, and also to reclaim some environmental value and to recreate, to the extent possible, habitat for animals. And so it's important to stress that it'll never be what it used to be. Can't go back in time, and a lot of these industries are pretty harmful, but there are ways to manage it and to really get community people involved in doing that, since they live close by, and they're going to be living with those toxic sites for a really long time. So,
right. I just woke up from a nap before this. I'm like, does J-Rob would like to know, does the oil kill fish in nearby water?
So I'm not as familiar with oil sands, so I'll try to answer as best as possible, but you might have to Google some things afterward. But essentially, so oil that I'm most familiar with are the oil sands in northern Alberta, and so that's a different process than oil wells or fracking. But essentially what they're doing is called oil mining. So it is pulling oil up from under the ground. It's a similar process, kind of on a broad level as mining. But what happens is you'll have kind of contaminants, different kinds of chemicals, and also bitumen and leftover bits of oil that are in the kind of slurry ponds or tailings, oil tailings, which is the same kind of word that I was using before. And so that can be really harmful for the environment because it introduces chemicals into the water system that wouldn't normally be there. And so it's not necessarily that it's killing people, but it's just changing the chemicals in the environment, which can be really difficult for different kinds of species and for animals. Mm-hmm. And a problem that they've had with oil sands is also just habitat destruction, right? So it's not always just about the kind of toxic chemicals that are introduced from these processes, but also just that it really destroys habitats and pulls up trees and fragments habitats as well, which right. is not good for animals and also not good for people living in those areas, especially in northern Canada. It's Indigenous territories, and a lot of people who rely on hunting and gathering practices for their cultural, it's culturally important, and it's also really important for northern economies. So yeah.
All right. Teddy and Amelia would like to know, do you take samples of the acid to study how to fix it?
I don't take samples of it, but yes, the kind of broader team of lots of scientists working on these projects take samples. They take water samples, and they'll measure it for a lot of different things. So pH, which is the acidic amount of the amount of acidity in the water. They'll also measure it for lots of different things. So I mentioned the Faro Mine. It's an old lead zinc mine, so they're measuring it for elevated or high levels of lead, of zinc, of another thing called magnesium, which is also an issue. And so with higher levels of those minerals in the water can have effects on fish especially, and other things that are coming into contact with the water.
Cool. So how did you first get interested in this area of science?
Well, I'm actually, my undergrad was in political science with a focus in environmental governance and environmental management. So I'm kind of coming at it from more of a social perspective, but I really like kind of the interdisciplinary of the field of geography. So there's a lot of really great people from so many different backgrounds working within the science of geography. And I was really interested in working in Northern Canada. I'm Canadian, and working on these kind of mining, these large mining and extractive projects, I think are really important, especially within the Canadian context, to figure out how we can manage it better, and how we can do it more responsibly, and also how we can take care of the kind of messes that we've already made. And so that's why I'm interested in that.
Awesome. Kyles would like to know, do you find the local population have a good understanding of the science and methodology behind the remediation programs?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the communities that I work with are mostly small, mostly Indigenous communities. And so they have a fantastic, obviously, understanding of their territories and their land. And have stories from, you know, decades and generations of mining. And so a lot of people worked on those sites, and a lot of people even worked on the exploration and discovery of some of these sites that are decades old. So they've been there for a really long time, and they understand the sites really well. And they're also really invested in making sure that they're safe. And so people are really involved in what's going on the sites. And I think the kind of hardest part is communication about different kinds of expectations. So as I mentioned, there was different words used for these kind of cleanup processes. So there's like remediation, restoration, reclamation, rehabilitation. And I think a lot of times when we think about cleaning up a toxic site, or what's called like remediating it, people think that you can go back to what it used to be, or that there will be forest there again, or that it will, you know, have lots of moose and caribou on the site. But the reality is that that usually can't really happen, and we can just kind of make it as good as possible and as safe as possible. And a lot of these sites will require water treatment forever, right? The water's never going to be what it used to be, and that's really hard for people to not to understand, but to grapple with, because it's a really big change to a place that they really loved. So.
That's awful. Is it possible to take the rock that's come out and like bury it again in the mine?
That's a great question, and people ask it all the time. It is possible. It depends on the type of mine. So also when you take the rock out from underground, you break it up and you change the size of it, and the kind of surface exposure of it. So you can't, it's not easy to just put it back in, because when you've broken it all up, you've actually made the amount or the space it takes up bigger, if that makes sense, right?
Yeah.
You can put some of it back underground potentially. So I work at another mine in northern Quebec, in Inuit area called Nunavik. And that mine, they've looked at doing some of this stuff because the mine is totally underground. Some mines are open pit mines, or they're open to the air, so they're not underground. So it's not possible to do that. Some open pit mines, what they will do is you have your pit, and they'll put some of the contaminated materials back in the pit, and they'll be at the bottom of the pit, and then they'll let water go on top, like accumulate on top, and they'll put water on top. That water will be toxic because it's been exposed to all of the contaminants underneath, but if they're able to contain the water in there, the water can actually act as like a seal for the contaminants underneath. it's good in theory, and there's some mines that use kind of these like water capping systems, but it's really hard to actually control the rock in around the pit too. So there's crevices where water can get out or water can get in, and a lot of sites it's really important to keep clean water separate from the dirty water. So if there's clean water flowing into the site, they don't want it coming in contact. And so, yeah, it's really hard, even with underground mines, to control over long periods of time groundwater or seepages or anything like that. So sometimes the only feasible way of doing it is capping it on surface, and that's because it's easier to monitor and to control. Yeah.
Raphael would like to know, can any big cities get fixed?
Big cities. Like to, for industrial sites in cities?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm talking about mostly remote, like really big mines. In Canada, a lot of the really big mines are not close to cities. And that's kind of an interesting justice question as well, as who has to deal with these kinds of sites. But with cities, there's a lot of other issues that I'm not as familiar with, but they're mostly industrial sites, so like chemical plants, things like that, or any kind of other processing or industry. And that kind of adds to the pollution or issues around cities. There's also like waste dumps, right? So the garbage dump, those kinds of things. So they use similar tactics of cleaning up dirty soils, and putting liners on them, putting caps on top of them. There's a lot of industrial and chemical sites in cities where they have to collect all of the soil that's has contamination and put it in a safe place. So they'll put it in some kind of controlled waste management infrastructure system. And a lot of places do really interesting things too, with like abandoned factories or abandoned contaminated spaces where they make them into different kinds of parks or community spaces after they've been cleaned up. So there's a lot of really interesting ideas about how to manage those kinds of urban spaces as well.
Yeah. Lily would like to know, why do you have to keep the clean water from the dirty water?
Oh, also awesome question. So on a lot of these sites, as I said, water treatment will have to happen forever or for like a really long time. And the best way to kind of minimize how much water treatment that you have to do, and to also keep fish safe and to keep people and animals and plants safe, is to make sure that all of the clean water that's flowing around the site, so if you have like a site that's in this area, a mine site that's this big, you want to make sure that any of the water coming into that area is staying as clean as possible, because when it goes out of that area, it'll still be clean and you don't have to put as much stress on a water treatment system. It's also really hard to control water. It does what it wants, right? And it changes a lot over time and how it flows and where it goes. And you also have surface water from rain and rivers, and you have groundwater that's underneath. Yeah, the geologists and hydrologists and biologists work really hard to limit how much of the water is dirty in order to, and when I say dirty, I mean like contaminated, not dirt in it.
Yeah, exactly. Teddy and Amelia would like to know, what's the worst place you've ever been to? And let's say like maybe the most affected by humans place you've ever been to.
Ever been to? I think the question about cities is really interesting, because I think that like really, really large cities that have a lot of industry and a lot of waste, it becomes easier to see the impacts that people have because it's so concentrated, right? Like you can just see sprawling cities, especially when there's not a lot of like park space or green space. And so I think that's, I can't really think of a specific city, but just in general, I have like that image of really large urban landscapes. But I think that those spaces can be managed in a way that's like healthy for people and for animals, and that's doable, especially if you have really good waste management and recycling and reduction of how much people consume and what they throw away and that kind of thing. And I think on the other side of that, in kind of more rural or remote locations, one of the scarier sites that I've worked on is the Giant Mine. So it's a mine in the Northwest Territories in Canada, and it's actually kind of right in the city of Yellowknife, which is the capital city of the Northwest Territories. So if you can Google it if you want. It's beautiful. But that mine is really interesting because the city grew around the mine, and so now it's right next to the city, and it impacts a lot of people. And it's not like visibly, it doesn't look that scary because all of the contamination is mostly underground, and it's actually mostly arsenic contamination. And so they have 237,000 tons of arsenic contamination. And this is from a gold mine. So when they pulled the gold out of the rocks, it's a kind of rock that has arsenic in it. And when you heat up the rocks and smash them up to get the gold out, it transforms the arsenic into a different kind of arsenic, not rock arsenic, but the kind of like white powder that you see in like old movies. It's used as poison. And so it's a really, really poisonous place. And I think it's scary because if the controls around that arsenic aren't there, then it could really impact a whole community of people quite quickly. And so I think that this is a really long answer to the question, but I think it's interesting because you can't see it, right? You know that it's there and it's weighing on your mind, but it's not as visible. And I think some of those sites can be even scarier.
Yeah, that's for sure true. So you mentioned a couple times these other folks that have different jobs that are all related to what you're doing. So what does your team look like? Like who's on it? What do they do? And where do you fit into the whole thing?
Awesome. So as I mentioned, I'm kind of more of the social scientist. So I have, obviously I have to know everything that's going on site and be familiar with all of that. But they're such complicated sites that they require a lot of different kinds of people. So for the site that I'm working on right now, which is the Faro Mine, I mostly work with the local communities. So I work with Ross River Dena, which is the Dene First Nations right close by. So in that case, I mostly work with the chief and council and with their biologists and environmental managers that they have hired for their community. And so a lot of that work involves kind of broadly across their territory, a lot of water monitoring, environmental monitoring. They have land stewards, so that means people who from the community who are out on the land just making sure that things are good. Mm-hmm. And then on site, on the Faro Mine site, it's actually managed by the Canadian government because the mine was abandoned. So that means that the mining company went bankrupt and then they just left. And so now the government has to manage those sites. And in the United States, it's like Superfund sites, the similar kind of idea. And so with that team, I work with them. They have also a community engagement team that I work with. They also have a technical review committee that I work with. So that's engineers, water scientists, biologists, people looking at revegetation. So it's a really big team. And my job is kind of, for my research, is helping Ross River kind of communicate with the project team and vice versa, and also helping to make sure that Ross River's story of that mine is told, because they were really impacted by the mine and didn't get a lot of benefits out of it. And now they have to take care of it. So it's a lot about kind of communicating that story and communicating the science of what's going on site as well.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's really important. What's something that you wish everybody knew about, like how they can be more informed or like do better things in our lives, because we don't often see these sites. Like you see the jewelry that comes in, you pump your gas, but like we don't really have a concept of where the stuff's coming from, and like how can we be better citizens in that regard?
That's a great question. I think, I mean, I don't ever want to say like, don't use those things, or don't, have oil in your car and that kind of stuff, because it's obviously a important part of everybody's life. I think it's obviously about reducing consumption as much as you can, but I also don't think that it's about just individual actions. I think that a lot of it comes from people being involved in broader kind of political movements. So, voting for people who are trying to make mining and oil better, or to reduce the amount of mining and oil extraction that we have to do. I also think it's like gold and silver industries. Some of that material is used for really important purposes, but also some of it is just because humans value it because it's beautiful. And so kind of rethinking what value means and how it can have impacts is also interesting. And diamond mines are also like that, right? So it's a hard topic because jewelry is, beautiful, but it's something that I think people, as you said, they don't see the impacts of that kind of thing. And I think as well, for people who are interested, most in North America, at least the United States and Canada, most governments and regions will have what's called impact assessments, and they'll have public registries. So when these projects are being proposed, you can be involved if, to the extent you have time, or a lot of times there's also like community organizations that will be involved in these kinds of discussions. And I think the most important thing is that we think about what's left after the project. A lot of times there's so much emphasis at the beginning of a project put on the great jobs that it'll bring and the industry and services that it'll bring, and that's all really good, but it's really important from day one to think about what will be left behind at the end of the day. So there's kind of like, there's the personal choices of lifestyle choices, I guess, that can make an impact, but there's also those kinds of community-based involvement that I think is really important.
Cool. Are there certain plants or bacteria or any other critters that you can put in a toxic area that can help maybe turn them into something nice, or anything like that?
Yeah, so that's like a really fun question. There's a whole field called bioremediation. So this is looking at different kinds of plants and bacteria that can kind of like process the contamination or hold it in place, kind of. So they bacteria or plants that will take up contamination and kind of hold it rather than letting it go out into the environment. And so there's a lot of different options for that kind of thing, and there's a lot of really interesting research on that. At one of the sites that I'm familiar with in the Yukon, it's called the Minto Mine. They have like a whole research project looking at different ways that bacteria or grasses that have legumes and they associate with certain kinds of bacteria, nitrogen fixing, all these kinds of things, all this kind of like fun, wacky stuff. And it's really interesting. And the only problem is that a lot of times the scale of these sites, so just like there's so much contamination, that kind of remediation might not work to manage everything.
Right.
Because there's just so much that putting some bacteria or plant in there might not be able to take care of all of it. And a lot of times it also doesn't make it disappear. It just kind of holds it or changes the composition of some of the makeup of some of it. Yeah.
Cool. Awesome. Yeah. Okay, so we have 2 questions that we like to ask everybody at the end of these sessions before we wrap up, and then you can share anything you want to plug or anything like that. So the first question is what's something that you wish everybody in the world knew related to your area of expertise? And the other question is, what's something that you wish everybody in the world knew about literally anything? It can be as simple or significant as you'd like.
Oh man. Okay, for the first question, for my field specifically, I think, I guess when I was younger, or even in my undergraduate degree, I had never thought that I could do social science kind of in a science realm, and to work on some of these like really technical sites, and to work with engineers and biologists. And so I think that kind of expanding the my notion, I guess, of what it means to do science and to work with scientists. And I think it's really, really important that there's more people doing like social and policy work within the science field. And there's not enough of us. So I would love for people to think of that as a career option, because it's really exciting and really interdisciplinary. And for the last question, it might be a bit serious, but working in Canada, especially, and I know in the United States it's really important as well, is that all of this work is done on Indigenous territories. And so especially for extractive industries like mining and oil, that should be the center focus, I think, and working with those communities to make sure it's what they want, and to make sure that they're not marginalized, and to also kind of right some of the injustices of the past. And so I think across Canada, it's a really important discussion of what it means to live and to work on Indigenous territories. So.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Where can we find you online?
So I have Twitter. It's just at Caitlynn Beckett. And I have a webpage at Memorial Geography Department. So yeah, if you just Google Memorial Geography's Department, I have a profile on there.
Great. Okay, sounds good. All right. Well, thank you for taking the time to talk to us about your work. That was super cool and really informative, and something I had never learned about before. So I really appreciate that. We also have 2 sessions going on next week. We've got fossil preparation on Monday morning at 11 a.m. And then Wednesday, we've got endangered snail rescue at 2 p.m. Those times were both in Eastern Standard Time. Also next week for the adults only, we've got a trivia night on Thursday night. We've got Tyus Williams. He is an awesome science communicator, really energetic and wonderful. And he studies mammals. So, but really it's just it's a fun time for us to get together and talk about science and really enjoy our lives the best we can while we're trapped indoors. And you can find out more about that on Twitter at Sarah McAttack, that's me, and Skype Scientist is our Twitter handle there. You can support our program at patreon.com/SkypeAScientist or paypal.me/SkypeAScientist. As always, thank you, Erin, for being with us today. We really appreciate you. And thank you, Caitlynn, for taking the time with us.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.